Chapter 1. The Encounter at Sundown. The sun hung low in the sky, a ball of fiery orange and red spilling its last rays across the arid plains. The wind stirred up dust, swirling it in lazy eddies around the cracked streets of the little frontier town of Roanoke, a town that lived and breathed dust, horses, and the echo of boot heels on creaking wooden floors. Jack O'Connor, a mountain man through and through, rode into town on his trusty gelding, his hat tipped low against the scorching sun. The trail had been long and unforgiving, but he'd reached the town he'd been avoiding for weeks. Roanoke was a place he had no intention of staying long, just long enough to rest his weary bones before heading up into the hills again. His horse's hooves struck the hard-packed dirt of the main street, a rhythmic clip-clop that echoed against the saloon walls. Inside, the murmur of voices mixed with the jingle of glasses and the scrape of chairs as men talked low over drinks, their words lost in the haze of tobacco smoke and the scent of whiskey. Jack tied his horse to the hitching post outside, his spurs clinking sharply as he swung down from the saddle. His hand instinctively brushed the long rifle resting on his back before he pulled open the saloon door. The creak of the hinges was swallowed by the noise inside, but as he stepped through the threshold, the world seemed to pause for a moment. The heat of the room hit him like a wall, and he let his eyes adjust to the dim light. It was a rough crowd, cowboys nursing drinks, a couple card games going on, the faint clinking of coins, and the low laugh of the bartender polishing a glass. But then his gaze caught someone out of the corner of his eye, a girl no older than 20, her back pressed against the weatherwood of the saloon's far wall. She wore a faded dress, too small and patched in places, her hair tangled and matted, the sharp lines of hunger in her face. She was young, but the hard life of the frontier had made her seem older, the softness of a girl replaced by the guarded, wary eyes of someone who had learned to survive by any means. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a ghost of something lost, and for reasons Jack couldn't explain, he felt a pull toward her. The conversation around him slowed as he walked the bar, his boots echoing across the creaking floorboards. He leaned over the counter, ordering a whiskey with the ease of someone who had lived a hard life. The bartender slid the glass across with a nod before Jack turned to glance at her again. Her eyes met his for the briefest of moments, then quickly looked away. But not before he saw the brief flicker of defiance, of survival instinct that could only come from someone who had learned to fend for themselves in this unforgiving world. He couldn't help himself. "Can I buy you a drink?" Jack asked, his voice low and gruff. His fingers tapped against the rim of his glass, eyes still fixed on her. She stiffened, her hand clutching the side of her dress as though to pull it closer around her. The dusty, dim-lit room seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in that tiny moment. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. Then, without looking up, she added, "Can I buy you?" Her words hung in the air between them, thick with something that could have been anger or perhaps something more desperate. Jack felt a flicker of surprise, then a strange sense of something deep within him stirring. He stepped closer, a shadow falling over her, and for the first time she didn't flinch. "What's your name, miss?" Jack asked, his voice gentler now, despite the weight of his curiosity. She hesitated, then finally met his gaze with a hard look. "Sarah," she said simply, though it was enough to send a stir through Jack's chest. It was an ordinary name, but something about it felt like a plea, an invitation to know her, to uncover what lay beneath the toughness that had hardened her. "You don't belong here," Jack said, and the words were more of a statement than a question. "I belong where I make myself belong," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a defiance that felt as natural to her as the dust that clung to her skin. Her eyes, still guarded, softened just a fraction. Jack hesitated, his hand tightening around the glass. For a moment, the world outside the saloon seemed to quiet, and in that small space between them, everything changed. Chapter 2, Whispers of the Past. The days after their first meeting passed slowly, the kind of days that felt heavy with unspoken words and the weight of things left undone. Jack couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, though he tried to bury the thought. A man like him didn't get entangled in the troubles of others, especially not a girl like her. The dusty roads and the mountains called to him more than any human connection ever could. But something about Sarah kept him coming back to Roanoke, even when he told himself he had no reason to. It was on the third evening after their encounter that he saw her again. The town square was quiet, the light from the saloon spilling into the street like a warm, inviting glow. Jack had just finished a long ride, his body aching, his bones weary, when he spotted her, standing alone, arms crossed, leaning against the wooden post that marked the entrance to the saloon. She wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't drawing attention to herself. Her eyes, though, were sharp, alert, as if she were always looking for something or someone to run from. Her presence made Jack's stomach twist, though he couldn't understand why. He walked toward her, feeling the familiar weight of his boots on the ground. As he approached, the town seemed to grow quieter, the sound of wind and distant coyotes creeping in. Her eyes flicked up, meeting his, and for a second, Jack thought she might turn and walk away like before. But instead, she stood her ground, barely shifting. "Sarah," Jack greeted her, his voice steady, yet softer than usual. There was something about her that made him drop the usual hard edge he carried. "You waiting for someone?" Sarah's lips twitched, almost like she was going to smile, but it never fully appeared. Her gaze lingered on him, scanning his face as though looking for signs of weakness, as if he could break under her scrutiny. "No," she replied with sharpness that surprised him. "I'm just here." Jack nodded, not sure what to say to that. There was a stubbornness in her stance, an unspoken challenge that he found both infuriating and intriguing. He took a step closer, noting how the light from the saloon made her features seem softer, even though her eyes still held a quiet storm. "I don't believe that." "I don't care what you believe," she answered, the words coming out clipped. But there was a flicker of something vulnerable in her eyes that Jack couldn't ignore. He could see the weariness in her, the kind that ran deep, beyond just physical exhaustion. It was in the way she held herself, like she was always prepared to face the next fight. "You got somewhere to be?" Jack looked at her, a little surprised by the directness of her question. For all her tough talk, there was an ache hidden beneath the sharp edges, something raw that she was trying to keep buried. He could see it more clearly now than before, and it made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. "I was heading up to the hills." But he let the sentence trail off, feeling a strange sense of hesitation he hadn't expected. "Maybe I'll stick around for a while." She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken truth. Jack's hand went to his belt, fingers brushing the worn leather of his holster as he struggled to find the right words. He wasn't one for talking about his past, let alone the reasons that pulled him back to town, back to her. But something told him she wasn't going to just let him off the hook with a simple excuse. "I've been on my own a long time," Jack finally said, the words rough and uneven, a side of him he didn't usually share. "The quiet out there is the only thing I've known for years." Her gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You get used to it," she muttered, almost to herself, her voice low and distant. Jack frowned, watching her carefully. There was something more there, something deeper she wasn't telling him. He could tell from the way her shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of the world rested on them. She turned her gaze back to the street, a far-off look in her eyes. "I don't know how to live without the quiet," she said, almost to herself again. "The silence of the world can be the loudest thing, you know." Jack didn't answer at first, unsure of what to say to that. Instead, he stood there for a moment, the wind picking up a bit, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant echo of hooves. The town felt smaller somehow, like the distance between them had shrunk in ways he couldn't explain. "What happened to you, Sarah?" he asked quietly, his voice edged with something that felt like both concern and hesitation. She tensed, her shoulders drawing tight, as if she were preparing to run from a question. But she didn't. Instead, she turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. Her eyes, dark and guarded, held a storm within them, one that had been brewing for far too long. "I grew up where no one cared to ask," she said, her voice cold but resolute. "Learn to survive, learn not to trust." Jack's heart skipped a beat, and though he didn't fully understand, he knew she was telling him more than she wanted to, more than she could. He reached out, though it wasn't a touch she expected. His hand rested lightly on her arm, a silent offer of something he hadn't thought he could give, empathy. The moment stretched long, and for the briefest second, Sarah's face softened just a fraction before the guard came back up. She pulled away from him, but it wasn't out of anger. "I've got nothing for you," she said, the words sharp but carrying a faint hint of regret. "I don't want anything, Sarah," Jack replied, his voice steady. "Not yet." She didn't respond to that, and Jack didn't press her further. But as he watched her walk away into the growing shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something unspoken, fragile, and yet incredibly real. Chapter 3. The Bounty Hunter's Challenge. The sun had barely risen over the jagged hills when the sound of hooves echoed through the empty streets of Roanoke. The town, still sleepy from a long night of saloon chatter and whiskey-soaked laughter, was shaken by the arrival of a man who brought a different kind of energy, a bounty hunter. His name was Cole Harding, and he wasn't the sort to blend in. His leather duster, dark as the storm clouds on the horizon, fluttered behind him as he rode his massive stallion into the heart of the town. His boots hit the wooden sidewalk with a dull thud as he dismounted. Jack watched from the shadows of the saloon porch, his eyes narrowing. There was something in the way the man carried himself, a predatory air that seemed to set the entire town on edge. Jack had known his type before, ruthless, calculating, and cold as the wind that cut through the plains. Bounty hunters were no strangers to the West, but Cole Harding was different. Jack could feel in the air a crackling tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, and the way Harding kept looking around, as if searching for someone, made Jack uneasy. A few hours passed before Jack heard it, the sound of Ray's voices coming from the alleyway near the stables. He knew that voice. It was Sarah. Without a second thought, Jack strode toward the commotion, his boots crunching on the dirt road, the creak of his spurs echoing in the silence. When he turned the corner, he saw Sarah standing in the middle of the street, backed into a corner by Cole Harding, the bounty hunter's cold smile glinting in the afternoon sun. "Well, now, what do we have here?" Harding drawled, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "A runaway girl, hiding in plain sight." Sarah's back was pressed against the weatherwood of the stables, her eyes flashing with defiance that Jack recognized all too well. Her hand was clenched around the reins of a horse, as though it were the only thing holding her steady. "I'm not hiding from you," she shot back, her voice unwavering, though her body trembled slightly. "I'm not hiding from anyone." Harding took a step closer, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "Is that so?" he said, his tone turning darker. "Because I've got a little business with you. Mississippi word has it you've been on the run from some dangerous folks. You owe them something, don't you?" Jack stepped forward, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his coat, the weight of the gun familiar and comforting. "Leave her alone, Harding," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying the authority of a man who had been in more than a few standoffs. "This ain't your fight." Harding turned, his eyes narrowing as he sized Jack up. He looked at the mountain man, then at Sarah, then back at Jack. "And who are you supposed to be?" some kind of hero. This girl's been causing trouble, and I've been paid to collect. You do well to stay out of my way." Jack didn't flinch. "I don't take kindly to men who think they can push folks around, especially women who've had enough." Sarah looked up at Jack, her eyes wide with something between gratitude and fear. She had no idea who Jack really was, but the way he stood between her and Harding, the way his broad frame blocked her from the bounty hunter's advance, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance she wouldn't be dragged back into the past she had run from. Harding's lips curled into a snarl, and without warning, his hand went for his gun. Jack was faster, though, his hand a blur as he drew his own Colt, the sound of metal sliding against leather loud in the quiet street. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Harding's hand hovered above his holster, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. The wind picked up, sending a swirl of dust across the dirt road. The distant call of a coyote echoed over the plains, the only sound in the otherwise deathly stillness. "You don't want this fight," Jack warned, his voice cold as steel, his eyes never leaving Harding's hand. "Back down, and no one has to get hurt." But Harding's eyes gleamed with the kind of madness that only came with years of chasing men down, and it was clear he wasn't going to back down easily. "You think you can stop me?" Harding sneered. "You're just another wanderer. I don't take orders from drifters." The tension snapped when Harding made a move towards Sarah, stepping forward like a rattlesnake coiling before the strike. But Jack was quicker. His Colt aimed and fired in a split second. The shot rang out like thunder, but it wasn't aimed at Harding. It was a warning shot, a crack through the air that made the bounty hunter freeze. "I said back down," Jack growled, his voice low and steady, the threat unmistakable. Harding gritted his teeth, eyes blazing with fury, but he didn't draw his gun. Instead, he gave Jack one last look, full of venom, and took a slow, deliberate step back. "This ain't over, O'Connor," he hissed, his words sharp like a blade. "I'll be back for you both." With that, he turned on his heel and walked back to his horse, his boots thudding against the earth. The sound of hooves soon faded into the distance, and the tension in the air began to lift, though Jack's heart still raced in his chest. He turned to Sarah, who was still standing by the stables, her body stiff but her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something softer, something like gratitude. "You all right?" Jack asked, his voice gentle for the first time. Sarah nodded slowly, though her breath still came in shallow gasps. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jack gave her a small, reluctant smile. "You don't owe me nothing. But next time, stay out of trouble. The West ain't a place for folks like you." For a moment, she held his gaze, her eyes softening as she finally spoke the words she hadn't yet dared to say. "Thank you, Jack. I didn't think anyone would stand up for me." Jack didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't the type to seek praise or gratitude. But he did know one thing. This was only the beginning, and he was already too far in to turn back now. Chapter 4. The Ride into the Storm. The storm came without warning. One moment. The prairie was bathed in the soft glow of a fading sunset, the golden light stretching out across the fields in endless rows of amber. The next, the sky darkened, shifting from dusky pinks and oranges to ominous shades of gray, clouds swirling in a dance of thunder and wind. A low rumble of distant thunder echoed across the vast expanse, a warning that the weather was about to turn vicious. Jack had just finished a long day's ride, the creak of his saddle and the rhythm of his horse's hooves soothing his weary mind. He was just about to head back toward his small cabin on the edge of the hills when he saw Sarah again. This time, she was on foot, walking the main street with a stubborn tilt her chin as the wind kicked up dust around her. The fragile, worn shawl she wore around her shoulders did little to protect her from the cold gusts that were sweeping through the town. Without thinking, Jack spurred his horse forward, The animals' hooves pounding against the dirt road. The wind howled, and the sky above them seemed to close and as clouds raced to meet one another. The smell of rain filled the air, mixed with the earthy scent of sagebrush. Jack's instincts kicked in as he saw Sarah struggle against the rising wind, her body pressed low against the gusts. "Sarah!" he called out, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. He was close enough now to see the worry on her face, the way her steps faltered as the first drops of rain began to fall. She looked up at him, startled, her expression hardening when she saw who it was. But the storm was coming fast, and Jack wasn't about to leave her out in it. "You ain't going to make it through this by yourself," Jack said, pulling his horse to a halt beside her. "Get up here. I'll take you somewhere safe." Sarah hesitated, the words on the tip of her tongue. The storm was getting worse, and the harshness in her eyes flickered just for a second, replaced by something softer, something that almost looked like relief. She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped toward him, her face still hardened with pride, but the way she placed one hand on the saddle told him everything he needed to know. She was scared, but she wasn't about to show it. Jack reached down, his calloused hand wrapping around her wrist, guiding her up onto the horse behind him. She gripped him tightly, her arms snug against his back as they rode into the gathering darkness. The wind howled, biting at their faces, but Jack didn't slow. The rain began to fall in sheets, turning the dry earth to mud beneath the horse's hooves. It wasn't long before the sky split open, lightning flashing in jagged streaks, followed by the deafening boom of thunder. The storm had come a vengeance, and there was no turning back now. Sarah's body pressed against Jack's, the cold, wet fabric of her dress sticking to her skin. She shivered, though she tried to hide it. Jack could feel the tension in her body, the way she clung to him, partly out of necessity, partly out of something more, something that made the storm outside feel insignificant in comparison to the storm that was brewing between them. "Hold on," Jack muttered, urging his horse to move faster as the rain grew heavier, soaking them to the bone. The wind stung his face, and the darkness around them seemed to stretch for miles. But Jack was used to the wild. He'd been out here alone for years, had ridden through storms worse than this. But the feel of Sarah behind him, her grip tight on his waist, made something inside him ache. They reached the cabin just as the sky opened up completely. Jack pulled the horse to a stop in front of the small wooden structure, barely visible through the rain and the dark. He dismounted first, his boot sinking slightly into mud, and turned to help Sarah down. But she didn't need his help. Sarah slid off the horse, her feet landing firmly in the muck, and stood up straight, shaking off the last of the storm's fury. She pulled her soaked shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wet strands of her hair sticking to her face. Her eyes met Jack's, a silent communication passing between them that neither of them fully understood, but both felt. Jack reached out, guiding her inside the cabin where the warmth of the fire immediately surrounded them. The small, stone hearth crackled with life, the orange glow casting long shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. Jack quickly hung his coat by the door and poured a drink for both of them, the whiskey's warmth almost a physical thing as it slid down his throat. "I didn't think you'd come for me," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper as she sat down by the fire, her hands held out to catch the warmth. Jack stood across from her, watching her carefully, his thoughts racing. The storm outside was fierce, but it was nothing compared to the storm that had been swirling inside him since the moment they met. He had kept his distance, kept his feelings buried deep, but tonight, in the quiet of the cabin, everything felt different. "You were out there alone," Jack said simply, his gaze steady as he took another swig of whiskey. "I couldn't just leave you." Sarah's eyes softened, but the wall she had built around herself quickly came back up, and she looked away, staring into the fire. "I can take care of myself," she said, though her voice wavered ever so slightly. "I always have." Jack's jaw tightened, the ache inside him growing stronger. He wanted to say something, to reach through the walls she'd built, but he didn't know how. Instead, he poured her a drink, just as silent, just as unsure. The storm outside raged on, the thunder cracking through the night sky. But in the small cabin, there was only the sound of the fire crackling and the soft, steady breath between them. Neither of them spoke for a long while, but the quiet shared in that moment felt like the beginning of something neither could name. Something fragile and dangerous, like the storm outside, but something neither of them could ignore. Jack couldn't explain why, but as he watched her, the distance between them seemed to shrink. There, in the warmth of the cabin, with the storm raging just beyond the door, he knew that whatever had started between them was far from over. It was only beginning. Chapter 5, A Love Born in Fire. The days after the storm passed were quieter, but no less charged. Roanoke was a small town, the kind where people knew one another's business before the sun had set. Yet, despite the gossips and the ever-watchful eyes of the townsfolk, the weight of Jack and Sarah's unspoken bond seemed to hover over them like a silent storm, waiting for the right moment to break. Jack tried to keep his distance, just as he always had. His cabin was isolated enough to keep the world at bay, and he liked it that way. He had been alone for so long that the idea of company, real company, seemed foreign. But Sarah, she had a way of slipping past his defenses, quietly demanding his attention, even when he tried to ignore it. It wasn't long before the Outlaws found her. Jack had heard the whispers in town about a gang, bitter men with hard faces who had earned their living by forcing others into servitude, stealing and killing with impunity. But it wasn't until he saw the same group of rough men circling Sarah that his heart truly sank. It was late in the afternoon, the sky already dimming as Jack made his way into town. He'd heard rumors that Sarah had been seen at the edge of the saloon again, but when he arrived, his stomach dropped. A group of men, grimy, ragged, and hard-eyed, had Sarah cornered in the alleyway beside the saloon. Her back was pressed against the cold brick wall, her body rigid with fear. Jack's gut twisted. He knew these men. These were the same ones who had made her life hell before she ran. And now they were back, their greed sharper than ever. "Sarah!" Jack shouted, his voice booming over the noise of the town. The wind carried the sound, sending it through the narrow streets. She looked up, eyes wide, and for a fleeting second there was a flicker of hope. Hope that Jack might be her salvation. But before she could speak, one of the outlaws, the leader, a man named Griggs, stepped forward, a wicked grin spreading across his scarred face. Well, look what we have here," Griggs sneered. His hand went to the holster at his side, his fingers brushing the grip of his gun. "You think you can protect her, O'Connor?" Jack didn't hesitate. His hand went to his own Colt, the weight of the weapon familiar in his grasp. He didn't need to speak. His action spoke louder than any words ever could. The tension was thick, like a rope pulled too tight, threatening to snap at any moment. "I'm not here to argue, Griggs," Jack said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Let her go." Griggs laughed, the sound rough and cruel. "She's ours, O'Connor. She owes us, and you're too late. We've got unfinished business with her." Sarah's eyes flickered with a combination of fear and rage, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Jack knew. He could feel the weight of the history between her and these men. Too many memories of pain, of being forced into a life she had fought to escape. The anger that rose inside him burned hotter than the midday sun. Without warning, Griggs took a step closer to Sarah, his hand reaching for her arm. That was all it took. Jack was already moving, faster than a rattlesnake strike. The first shot rang out like thunder, echoing through the alley. Griggs' hand stopped midair, his fingers twitching, and he staggered back, his face contorted in pain. The sound of the second shot followed immediately, a blur of motion as Jack's gun went off again. The rest of the outlaws flinched, reaching for their own weapons. But Jack was faster, his gun danced in his hand, a deadly rhythm that sent two more men stumbling backward, hands clutching at their wounds. But the leader wasn't finished. Griggs recovered quickly, pulling out his revolver and firing at Jack in one fluid motion. The bullet grazed the side of Jack's coat, sending a sharp pain through his ribs, but he didn't flinch. He didn't stop. The third shot from his Colt rang out just as Griggs was lining up his next shot. The outlaw crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading beneath him. The alley fell silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the distant echo of a door slamming in the saloon. The rest of the outlaws were either dead or too injured to fight back. Jack holstered his gun and stepped forward, the sound of his boots heavy on the wood. He reached Sarah, who was still pressed against the wall, her body trembling, though she was too proud to show more than a flicker of fear. The tension between them felt like fire, hot and raw. "Are you hurt?" Jack asked, his voice gentle but firm. Sarah's eyes locked onto his, her breath coming in shaky gasps. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought they'd take me back." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her as her legs threatened to give way beneath her. "Not while I'm here," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. For a moment, neither of them moved. There was only the sound of Sarah's ragged breath and the distant call of the coyote in the hills. The storm that had once been the wild weather outside now raged inside them both, raw and unspoken. "I won't let them take you," Jack murmured, his thumb brushing against her damp cheek, where a tear had slipped free. Her eyes softened, and for the first time the hardness around her heart seemed to crack. Her hand moved slowly to his chest, pressing against the fabric of his shirt, as if seeking some kind of grounding, some kind of truth in the chaos of her world. "I don't know what to do, Jack," she said, her voice small but full of the weight of her past. "I don't know how to live a life without being chased." "You don't have to," Jack replied, his voice thick with the weight of the promise. "Not anymore." They stood there in the alley, in the remnants of the violence that had unfolded, but in that moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The world outside, the dust, the pain, the fear, felt distant, irrelevant, as if it had never been. All that mattered was a quiet trust that had been forged in fire, a trust that neither of them could deny any more. And for the first time in a long time, both Jack and Sarah believed in something more than just surviving. They believed in each other. Chapter 6. The promise of the future. The storm that had broken over them just days before it passed, leaving behind the sharp, fresh scent of rain on the earth and a lingering promise of change. Roanoke, a town that felt like a desolate ghost town just weeks earlier, was now alive with a quiet buzz. The tension that had weighed on its streets had lifted, and a sense of calm was slowly making its way through the town like the slow-moving light of a sunrise breaking over the horizon. Jack stood on the porch of his cabin, staring out across the vast, golden plains that stretched endlessly before him. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky with hues of purple and orange, casting long shadows over the land. It was a peaceful evening, the kind of evening that made Jack feel at home in a way he hadn't felt in years. Beside him, Sarah stood quietly, her hand resting lightly on the rough-hewn wooden railing of the porch. She was still adjusting to the stillness of life here, still finding her place. Jack could tell she was still learning how to trust, how to feel like she belonged. But it was different now. Between them, there was no longer a distance that couldn't be bridged. The walls she built around herself had come down, piece by piece, and Jack had watched it happen slowly, with care, never pushing her, but always there when she needed him. He could feel her presence beside him, even before she spoke. "It's beautiful here," Sarah said softly, her voice a little rough, as if the wind itself had carried away the last of the hesitation from her heart. Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's the only home I've ever known. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken acknowledgement of the shared moments that had led them here, together, in this place that felt more like a promise than a reality. The fire from the evening had softened the air, and Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath clouding the cool evening air. She didn't need to say anything more, but Jack could see the question in her eyes, the same one she'd been asking herself for days now. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, like the wind might carry her words away if she spoke too loudly. She didn't turn to face him, but Jack could feel her gaze, heavy and searching. Jack shifted, taking a deep breath. He wasn't one for easy words or promises, not after everything he'd seen. But this was different. This was something he couldn't walk away from, no matter how much the idea of tying himself down had once terrified him. He stepped closer to her, the weight of his boots on the porch boards louder than he would have liked. But as he reached out, he was careful, slow, offering her the same steadiness he had when he first offered to take her to safety from the storm. The same steadiness he had offered every time they'd stood side by side, facing the world together. "I don't know what the future holds," Jack said, his voice quiet but sure. "But I do know that I don't want to face it alone. And I don't want you to either." Sarah turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. Her lips parted, as though she were about to say something, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't used to promises, wasn't used to being told she wasn't alone. She wasn't used to someone wanting to share their future with her, someone who saw more in her than just a past full of mistakes. Jack's hand found hers, warm and solid, grounding her to the present, to the moment that stretched out before them. "This place," he said, nodding toward the land that had become his sanctuary. "It's yours too now, if you want it." For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. The air between them seemed thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the answer that would change everything. The sun sank lower, leaving only a trace of daylight that fought against the gathering shadows. Sarah's fingers curled around his, her palm fitting perfectly against his callous skin. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and soft, the hardness that had once defined her features now gone. In its place was something gentler, something he hadn't expected, but that he'd hoped for in the quietest parts of himself. "I want it," she said simply, her voice low, but filled with a kind of quiet strength that made Jack's heart swell in his chest. "I want this. I want you." Jack's chest tightened, the weight of her words settling over him like a cloak, warming him in ways he hadn't known he needed. He reached up, his hand cupping her face gently, his thumb brushing away a stray strand of hair that had fallen into her eyes. "You don't have to make any promises, Sarah," he said softly. "Not to me, not anyone. But know this, what's between us, it's real. And I'm here, whatever comes next." She nodded, her gaze unwavering as she took a step closer to him. The sound of distant coyotes in the hills, the rustling of the wind through the trees, it all seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, standing on the porch as the night sky stretched out above them. The promise of a future that wasn't built on survival, but on the possibility of something more. Sarah's breath caught as she reached up, her hands steady as they rested on his chest, feeling the beat of his heart beneath her fingers. "Then I guess I'll be here too," she said, her lips curving into a small, hesitant smile. Jack smiled back, a smile that didn't come easily, but one that felt right now, more than it ever had. "We'll make it work," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Together, in that moment, with the fire of a new future flickering between them, they both understood something that had been uncertain for so long. This was their beginning, their chance to build something they hadn't thought possible, a love, a life, a future. And as the last rays of the sun faded into the horizon, Jack held Sarah close, his arms wrapped around her as though he could keep the world at bay. In his heart, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The storm had passed, but the promise of what lay ahead was something neither of them could deny. It was only the beginning. The sun hung low over the plains, casting the sky in a rich golden glow that stretched across the endless horizon. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dust. Sweeping across the dry earth, the rhythm of hooves the only sound that broke the quiet. Jack O'Connor sat on his horse, his hat tipped low against the wind, his eyes fixed on the distant cabin where Sarah waited. It had been months since the gunfight with the Outlaws, since the storm that had brought them together, since that night when he'd held her in his arms, promising that nothing and no one would tear them apart. Sarah stood at the porch, her silhouette framed by the setting sun, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she watched him approach. Her hair, wild from the wind, glowed like fire in the last light of the day, her figure strong and sure, just like the woman she had become. As Jack dismounted, their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The harshness of the world, the roughness of the land. It all melted in the presence of something stronger, something that neither time nor danger could tear apart. "I didn't think I'd ever find a place to belong," Sarah said softly, stepping down the porch steps. "But this with you, it's home." Jack's heart swelled, and he reached out, his rough hand brushing against hers. "Then it's ours," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This land, this life, we belong here. Together." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, warm glow. The two of them stood there, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. And for the first time, neither of them was alone.